So I guess one way to start our conversation would be to recognise that in a way I feel as though VR's been around for a long time, but it's also just arriving in the sense that there seems to be stable technology and a lot of investment in creating consumer level products. And so in a way it feels like there's an enormous amount of technology waiting for content. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What are we going to do about that?
Well, we just got to make better stuff, I think. You know, it's, and we were talking about this earlier too, which I think is an important thing to note, even though the technology is going to keep evolving very rapidly, especially, you know, working at Google, I see it happen constantly, and I have to, like the rest of us, have to catch up and, you know, work around those things. There are fundamentals about the medium, and there's language in VR that will not change. What's remarkable, it feels like it's rattling or something. What's remarkable about that is that, you know, for the past year, there have been a lot of people talking about pragmatics, about how, you know, I can list them off if you want, but like VR is a new medium. It's like, okay, you know, VR is a very powerful medium. It's okay. It's about human experience. Okay, but now what? You know, I think it's time that we get real with it. You know, I think there are pieces of it that are emerging that I think are fundamental to the medium, that is a platform on which we can start to build actual pieces of content that are in themselves meaningful, and not just about capturing something in 360. It's about actually creating these experiences and making good content. So I do think there is a language. I do think it's emerging. I do think there are things that we can latch onto, and I think now it's about getting down to using that as tools to make stuff.
I think that's a fascinating thing. It reminds me a little bit of when cinema first was invented. You have those wonderful apocryphal stories about the first shot of a train coming into the station, and when it was screened, the audience ran screaming from the room, apparently.
Oh, yeah, apparently it isn't, yeah, it didn't really happen, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a good story.
Yeah.
And it feels...
we like those, don't we?
Feels a little bit like as though we're trying to do things we're already doing with VR, but the leap will be when we're doing things that you can only do in VR. And it does feel like we're in baby steps land at the moment. Is that your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, mediums are good at doing certain things, and you know, books are good at certain things and not good at other things. Film's good at doing certain things and not doing certain things, and VR is the same. VR isn't a replacement for any medium that exists. You know, it's just another interpretation of our experiences, and it's actually more, you know, more relevant to experiences because it is about experience. So I think that there are things that we learn that VR is, actually it was interesting, a friend of mine's working on a project, a film project, that's an adaptation of a book. And what I actually ended up doing was going through the book and basically as a filmmaker saying, okay, so these are the parts that in VR would be really hard to do, that as a film would be immensely good. Like, he should do these parts. And these parts are harder to do and probably would be difficult to translate, but in VR would be really cool. A lot of it's internal monologue, a lot of it's contextualizing something, dreams, memories, perception shifts. And then suddenly you have these two mediums actually working in tandem. Like, basically you have film and VR working together to create a book, to sort of do what books are good at doing, but then expanding on that and doing something else. So I think that mediums can do something quite remarkable. VR can work with other mediums to sort of expand on what maybe they're not, things that are not their strengths. But VR in of itself also is, and doing so, you can recognize the things that VR is also not particularly strong at doing.
Yeah. I'm fascinated from my limited experience of VR that when we were making a piece, we were actually struggling for language. We're actually trying to find a way. We have an enormous amount of orthodoxy around filmmaking and television. It's been a 100-year-long process of knowing how to do the task of making in that space. But with VR, requires, because it is not the same, it's doing a different job, it almost requires a new language. You've been a bit of a pioneer in helping us to find ways of actually putting words to the things that we do in that space. I noticed that you call people visitors rather than what else, viewers or immersants or any other term. Why is that distinction important, do you think?
A lot of the stuff that I do is a result of my brain just being kind of crazy. Like, I'm actually doing it more for, I mean, I do it for everybody, but it's also in a way that I could then talk about what's happening in my own head with this stuff. So they become graphs of circles with X's in them, just to be like, it's like this. The visitor shift was, for me, just a realization that, like, if I keep calling this person that's in the experience the viewer, I run the risk of limiting myself and falling back on old habits. So like right now, you're all in the audience and you're watching me and you're viewing us. But if you're on the stage, that would be a very different dynamic. You start to think about, you know, what happens when you are a visitor to a place that you don't know. How do relationships evolve over time? I use this kind of awkward example of, you know, you go to someone's house for like a house party or something. You don't really know anyone, you know a few people. You know, you see the food that's in front of you, and you have a choice between pre-cut cheese or olives with pits in them. And, you know, I always go for the pre-cut cheese because I don't want to have to deal with the pit and have to deal with other people watching me eat a pit and take a pit out of my mouth, and I don't know where to put the pit, and, like, it just anxiety immediately. But over time, I might eat an olive because I get to know people, maybe someone else that I know eats an olive. Like, it's, something as simple as choosing which food you eat at a party is an evolved sense of relationships in a space, comfortability in a space, familiarity in a space. And it's all about visiting a place that is unfamiliar, that over time no longer becomes unfamiliar. And it's subtleties in that are really important to understand, because you can, that's experience, and that's what VR is about, and it's about presence, and about bringing someone into a space that they are probably not familiar with. You need to kind of think about what actually happens to us when we go through something like that. Film, you know, in cinema, what it did was it kind of observed how we observe things. Like, yeah. In our minds, like, how do we deal with observing the world and other people? You know, what is the filter for us? How do we change the way that we experience something by turning our heads or turning a camera? And it responded to that. But now we're in a situation where, I mean, you're basically allowing for a person to go into a space and then essentially just become the camera. I mean, then it becomes like, how do you compel someone to look somewhere? How do you compel a camera to do a certain thing? How do you lose control of that? So I think it's also a lot about, like, as a creator, how do you handle? How, as a host?
The loss of control. Yeah. I mean,
or it's a different control, I suppose. It's more like seeds and.
I think it's a fascinating point, because my background is film, and you know, it's the last bastion of the fascist in a way. You want total control over what the audience is going to experience, right down to depth of field. You can control infinitely almost where you want your audience member to have their attention, but it's not like that. Even in terms of the time frame of the experience you're providing in VR, in film, it's under your control, and that there's no audience interaction with that. But in VR, that's not the case. That you need to have a different understanding of what time is in the experience of VR, I guess. You need to allow more time for people to want. Sorry,
yeah, I'm hearing it too, but it's really bothering me.
Can we back them off a little bit? Hello. Do you want to swap to the handhelds? Okay.
Stand by.
There you go.
Well, thank you.
It should be on.
Hi. I was just, honestly, I was almost going to just do this anyway, because I was like, I'm hearing things and it's driving me nuts.
Is that better? Great. Sorry about that.
Sorry. Should we start from the beginning?
Anyway,
so visitor, yeah.
This is Jessica.
Lost control. Hi. Work at Google.
So that loss of, is it a loss of control, or as you were saying, control of a different sort?
I was like relishing in the lack of feedback. Sorry. No, I think it's a just different. It's a different kind of control, just because I think it's a different. You're a magnitude out. I think we talked about this as well, where we basically, mediums so far have been filters to experience, right? You have an experience, you leave the experience. Someone says, "Hey, how'd it go?" Like, like, oh well, and then I think back to what happened, and then I provide them with an interpretation, which is story. And then how I go about that is the medium. Either I talk about it, I write about it, I show a photo, I show a video, I show a film. It can be as crafted or as uncrafted as I want, but it's my interpretation of an experience that I've had. But in VR, it's you're enabling someone else to have the experience that will then give them the story to tell to someone else. So it's removed control. It's the potential for story, not a kinetic version of a story. And so you're less the storyteller, more the creator of the universe where story can happen. So it's actually a much awesomer, more awesome, awesomer. Gonna make up words. It's just it's a really amazing job. It's just not the same job.
So the act of creating, or authorship, if we want to call it that, in this space is choices around the world that you want the visitor to enter. What other sorts of choices do you have available when you're creating that world? Do you have infinite choice, or what would you say is the repertoire?
I think, well, I think it's I think it's around 4 things that I think about. It's, world building, which is to what you said, like how do you construct these places for people to go? And who are the inhabitants? What's the universe? Understanding who the visitor is, which is identity, really. That could just be like who, from a physical reality, real reality standpoint, who are these people that are coming in? And the secondary part of that is, are they a character that's important? Are they a primary character? Are they a ghost? Do they have agency? Do they not? What are their tools? What can they do? The third is attention, just generally understanding from a presence standpoint what we're prone to immediately gravitate towards, like what are we wanting to do there? And then the fourth is engagement, which is really just about how the world and the visitor connect, which, I think great VR happens when they do, and not so great VR happens when one is elevated higher than the other. Usually it's the world. People tend to be like, oh, I'm going to film Machu Picchu, and that will be great for everybody. And it's like, I don't care about Machu Picchu, but you didn't care that I didn't care. You just did it because you wanted to do it, which is fine, but then you have to prepare for the experiences running flat. So I think those are the things that, it's a lot to consider, but I consider all of those things.
The concept of agency or identity is kind of evolving, isn't it? Because the primary one is just to be present and to be, in a way, put into a world and simply observe. So it's observation or documentary in a sense, and you have no other responsibility except to observe in that environment. But it seems you're suggesting there's more complex ways in which you can have that relationship.
Oh, definitely. Beyond just what people do in a linear sense, thinking about the spaces that evolve, like we as humans have built spaces to bring people into our homes. There's a driveway where you park your car. There's a front door that you knock on and you open, you say hello and come in or don't come in. They come in, and usually, it's not like you just get dropped in the kitchen and you're making food with everybody. Like there's a process, there's a cadence, there's a dance. And so we kind of need to think about how that translates. Like each experience has a very different purpose. Each world has a different purpose. A driveway is not a kitchen, right? And each of them have, different ramifications as well. Like if you're in the middle of a dance floor and you're dancing with a bunch of people, it's about the energy of being on a dance floor with folks. It has a particular feeling, it has a particular vibe. Going to bed is different than that. It has a purpose. It's meant to be a place where here's where you go, here's where you sleep. It's dark, it has its own vibe as well. A family is different than a classroom, which is different than work, which is different than here. So thinking about the construction of the energy of a space, thinking about the purpose of each world that you are filming or capturing or creating, I think is important. And that is a narrative layer. You can decide in the beginning that you want a very pointed thing, like I want you to observe sort of this thing, and I want most of what's happening in that world to drive you or compel you to see that, hopefully. But then maybe if you keep making someone do that too often, then they're gonna just be like, you know, what's the point? Like, why do I even matter? So then occasionally you may want to give them a chaotic place. Nothing that makes them, like, drives them nuts, but maybe just something where, you know, they can relax for a second. They can be a voyeur. They can make their own decisions. They can have their own thoughts. And then you start to create memories. Then you start to give them a chance to own the experience, which is what, you know, and feel validated, which is all we ever want to do anyway, you know, is feel like we matter.
So in a way, you're providing primary experience. You're yes, providing environments in which people can have a set of curated primary experiences which they can do with what they wish. Mm-hmm. As you say, manufacture their own stories from those experiences.
Yeah, I mean, it's more like we're not, even when I say story at the end of it, I really just mean like something that hits a general story ballpark, right? Even the idea of like the inevitable story will always shift. You'll all leave here with, you know, the same thing happened. And actually, I would argue most of you are probably looking this direction, right? So you're all sort of getting the point of what this place is meant to do for you. But when you leave, you're going to have a very different story. It will maybe very subtly different, but, you know, it'll be different. And I think that will happen in a VR experience, whether or not the creator wants it to or not. So we can either, you know, pretend like it doesn't happen and force things and feel miserable, or we can embrace it and see where there's art in that.
We've sort of been talking a little bit about the world where you bring the visitor into the world by putting the camera in a certain place. That's part of the curation of that experience. But you also have the opportunity, as you were saying, to edit between, and or even before that, when you move into that space, it's not just, or it can simply be that the environment is provided and the visitor can check it out however they wish. But you also have the opportunity to try to direct their attention, or to place or imagine that there are events occurring in that space where you may want to direct their attention. Mm-hmm. How much control can a curator, filmmaker have in that, do you think?
I think it's just about understanding the other perspectives, is seeing, you know, what is it like if I look the other way? A game designer friend of mine does this thing where he looks in the direction that he believes the creator wants him to look, and then he looks in the opposite direction, just to see what's there. And he told me this in the beginning of when I was starting to work with this stuff. So I started doing it, and it is remarkable how little people care about everything else. Which makes, you know, begs the question, why VR, right?
Yeah.
Why capture a 360 environment if all that you care about is like a fifth of that? And so what I would do, and I do in all my experiences also, is, you know, when I block it out, that's why I use this circle graph that it reminds me of that it's a whole world of stuff. I'm going to show just some slides real quick, if that's okay. Walking over here. Something works. So, like, you know, this is how we traditionally sort of look at things, right? This is actually a stitch from something that I shot. And to see it like this is fine, and I still have to, because this is where things are right now. But if I were to, actually, the better way to look at it is something that's more like this. And when you start to look at things like this, you start to understand that there's a whole world to consider. And if you don't, you miss the point. And so for me, it's been mostly, you know, looking at it like this. The dotted line isn't so much important to me. It's just more to get a sense that there's engagement, and that person is providing kind of like a flashlight on a particular quadrant of that world. But yeah, I mean, it's just to say that and it's also like, you know, you get the sense there was a scene that I did once in one of my films where it's a violinist playing violin, and it's a young girl trying to figure it out. And that's the whole point of the scene, is to see her playing violin. Now, if you see her playing violin, and that's the source of the audio and all that, great, cool. But in the back, if you turn around and you look the other direction, you see her parents at the doorway watching her play. And the reason I did that is because I'd almost argue even that that is the better vantage point, to see the look on their faces as their daughter is playing violin and kind of getting it right, so they kind of grimace and they're listening to it. But you hear her behind you. So it's not like she's not there. She is, but she's represented in a different way. If you think about memories that we've had of things that matter to us, we don't necessarily remember the literal. We remember the nuances of it. It doesn't make it any less a sunset if I look at, you know, other people enjoying it, or if I look at my dog playing in the back. It makes it into a memory. It makes it into something more special. It makes it into something that like kind of latches onto your brain and says like, I matter as an experience. So I think, you know, using that and embracing that is important. Another thing though, like for instance, say you're at a fairground. This is a really dumb example, but I use it because I'm from Pennsylvania. If you don't know where that is, maybe you do. We have fairgrounds, and you can win goldfish by taking these ping pong balls and throwing them into little fish bowls. And the fish die the next day. They're like kind of really gross fish, but you're like, I'm gonna win the fish. And so I was imagining a situation where I would have to try to get someone to see that, see like a young girl do it, trying to like win this fish. What would happen in the rest of it? You know, if someone did look behind them, is it like, what can I show them back there that would also give them the impression that there was a game and there were fish and you could win them? So I was thinking about, you know, the games, just having games back there, the energy of like trying to win games, people like failing, people winning. Maybe there was water. Maybe there were people wearing like, you know, Bassmaster is like a big thing where I grew up too. So like people wearing Bassmaster shirts, like walking around. Like maybe someone's like, you know, has some fish poles. You know, there are boats. Maybe there's some like ceramics representation of fish. You start thinking about mise en scène again, and in a way that is more about fulfilling the rest of the space with the point, but they're all representations of the point. So you may not get the literal thing, but you may get the idea of it. So it won't be such a jarring thing to go to the next scene and see a girl with a little fish, like walking into her room and plopping it down on the table or whatever.
So in a way, when you think about that curation act in that way, it's almost as if you're placing bets on the experience the visitor may have. Mm-hmm. You're in a way moving the odds. An image like the one you just showed us, it has a very strong point of attention, point of interest. Mm-hmm. Whereas in a more mise en scène environment, as you're saying, you may be hedging your bets around where you want the audience attention to be. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of a variable that you have under your control to some extent, I guess, isn't it? To
some extent. Well, if you have like a glacier with like one solitary person walking on it, the chances are you're gonna probably look at that guy. So you can place a lot of bets on that. But in a situation like a fairground where there's a lot of activity, in order to make a convincing fairground, you have to have that. You have to embrace what that place is like naturally. Yeah. To have just the goldfish game with the girl playing it and nothing else seems like a lie. Yeah. Or a really good modern art piece. I don't know. But if you really want to try to be honest and truthful to the experience, you'd want to embrace what that experience is like. And then you have to think about, well, under those conditions, then what else do I need to do in order to allow for whoever's in there to come out of it with a general idea of what's occurred.
Yeah. And that VR experiences are not just one environment now. You transition, and transition initially seems that it should be incredibly wrenching, because it's as if we're sitting here and then suddenly we're in another room or in another space. But there's a lot of ways in which you can help that transition to be more seamless. What have you learned about the opportunities in that?
I'm smiling a lot because a friend of mine made a piece for the New York Times magazine, and his name's Ben Solomon, and he made a film called The Displaced. That was the first thing New York Times VR did. And I saw, I mean, I think he used some of my editing techniques, and it worked, and I was so happy. It's because I'm starting to see this being applied a lot more often, and it's really remarkable how it just makes me feel really good. I just feel like it's working. Like the whole point of it is really this idea of understanding the engagement of a person in a particular world. So in the case of the glacier climber that you saw, although I'm not 100% sure, I could place a pretty solid bet that you'd be looking in that direction. And then I can do a couple of things. I can do a lot of things, but one of the things I could do is match that attention with something else that I think is important in the next world that you might have missed. So here, I'm going to show slides again. Sorry. It's just easier this way, I think. Cool. So editing. So if you think of editing in the traditional sense, right, you see frame to frame to frame, and that what we've kind of established with the worldview is that the frame is really led by the person in the experience. It's wherever you're looking. So it's, for a traditional film, that makes total sense. That's the whole point. It's a window into a world. But once you're on the world, it's more like the frame is everywhere. So then you have to really think about it like this, which are, worlds that extend from each other. And what you're really trying to find is a way to create a pathway through this universe that you're building. And in order to do that, you really just need to understand where the potential frame will be. So, in the case of the glacier climber, I can give a pretty solid bet that you'll look in that direction. And then I can, in the following world, provide something in that same area. And suddenly it feels like you are matter, like you're being, like something there is meeting your attention, and it feels like your mental engagement isn't severed. It feels continued. This is an example from a film that I did about the Montreal Canadiens ice hockey team. So I know you're looking that direction, and I can cut to this guy. And then, and he leads you, and I'm going to show this one more time just because it's literally there's a hockey game going on, and he's actually my favorite shot in the whole thing. But so the torch ceremony, it goes on for a little bit, and the idea is that you're obviously going to be watching this torch, or I can at least place a solid bet. And then I can, use that to my advantage, and then get you to connect with this guy. It's important to note what I could have done is just gone from the torch ceremony to the rink, which would have been fine, but then you would probably not have seen him at the time that you could have seen him. And what happens in this is you not only get to connect with someone in the space, which gives you validation, makes you feel like you're part of that space, feels like you exist in that space, but you also discover the rink. And discovery is a big part of this too. It actually makes you feel as if, or not makes you feel, discovery is a way that allows for us to believe that we matter because our memories matter. We can enhance our experiences this way. And I guess to go on with it, like once you start to really play with this, like, oh, here's something interesting, and the person looks there, and then I can basically do this kind of conversation, kind of like ins and out points, but you solve a bit of a cipher. And if you construct all of this correctly, or as well as you can create a pathway through the universes of these worlds that you build, based purely upon attention and human engagement. I'm going to sit down again. Yeah, I'm going to do that. Which is just to say that, it gets more complex because, once you don't have specific engagement or attention points, then you have to think about engagement, which is the difference between, if you ever think about market research, they do these like kind of, heat maps on a page. And if it's the difference between like if a baby and some text was on a page, and if you look at that page and the baby's looking at you, you tend to look at the baby. But if the baby is looking at the text, you end up looking at the text. And it's just that very simple understanding of how things interact with one another, how the world is constructed, what elements are in there, how they're engaging with each other as well as you. Then you can start to make better predictions on what people are doing or how they're engaging with things. you know, windows versus doors versus food versus a cat versus a dog versus, and then you can extend and respond to that. It becomes a really intricate dance, and the best editors in this space will find like really interesting ways to play with that, I think.
So it's obviously you've got the opportunity to spin the worlds around and in some sense to line them up visually. But when you're talking about attention in that sense or engagement, being engrossed, it's not necessarily only visual. It can be auditory and it can be other sorts of engagement.
Oh, definitely. Audio is a big thing. What I'll do is I'll drop people in all my experiences so far. I drop them into a world, or I drop you into a world where there is a hallway or a door or something that suggests where you've come from. So it gives you a sense of a journey. So it's not just like, I'm here, I guess. Except for the first film, which was like rocks, and then that was just rocks. But essentially what it is you hear something behind you and you're compelled to turn. And suddenly you realize, oh, I can do that. That's a thing I can do. And I want to do that because then I can discover things that matter. And like that's the whole point of this. Because what ends up happening otherwise is you drop someone in with the exact thing you're supposed to see in front of you and people don't move.
They think it's TV.
They think it's TV.
Yeah.
And they're fine with that. They're just like, cool, just going to watch this. And they totally miss the point. So audio is a really great way. Actually, without audio, I couldn't do a lot of the more intricate edits that I do now. Because that allows for me to sort of plant, you know, to compel and to coordinate people's movements in a space.
Wow. Okay. So in that, coming back to that temporal idea, you need to allow enough time for people to, like, how do you think about time when you're editing? Do you test it, or do you just have a sense now for the exploratory time required, or do you not worry if people miss something? How do you actually work with that time frame? I
guess I kind of do a mixture of all three. I mean, there's some times where I'm like, I know that in theory, in order for you to get this, I need to give you 5 minutes. But I don't want to, either because I want to give someone a little bit of anxiety or to feel a little bit like they missed something, or to have a want of going back there so that I can present that later. Like that's you know, it's, you can tease people like that a little bit. But you have to be smart about it, otherwise it feels sloppy. You can't do it all the time. You have to use discretion, I think. But you know, how you decide to navigate that is craft, I think.
Yeah. Do you, when you construct your pieces, do you think about them as single view experiences, or do you imagine that people will revisit? Is that, or are there different ones that you make for different purposes?
I kind of go through it with, I mean, I don't know. Like, I mean, I have to look at it 1 billion times, so I kind of do it so that I don't have to feel bored about it every time I do it. What's really fun is being able to like construct places where every time I go into it, I feel like I'm seeing it differently. So I'll like, I mean, that's the whole point about crafting the rest of the experiences too. What I've realized just by what I did for the first couple months after I had made World Tour, that was my first film. That was made with the purpose of announcing Jump, and to show that the rig worked and it was amazing, and that it was going to be a really big player in this space. But then after that, it was like, well, now what do I do? So I took a lot of the prototype rigs, or there wasn't a lot, there was one, that I had, and I would go around and film just random stuff. I would go help, say, the BBC do something just as a test, and then I'd, you know, take that rig to the Monterey Aquarium and film stuff just to see what I could get. Or I would go to Paris and film that and see what I would get. And just kind of just filming with the intention of not really expecting anything, but just seeing what would come back, which has been really awesome, because that's been what's allowed for me to see sort of what's been working and what's not. You know, the idea that mess is better. Like, we like mess. We like depth. We like things coming towards us or moving away from us. It kind of mentally gives us this kind of story or narrative for ourselves and our existence. One of the things that was also really interesting that was revealed to me through young girls playing soccer outside the Eiffel Tower, which was, I mean, talk about like great location, people lying around on the grass, people playing soccer, and suddenly this like girl just comes towards camera. And I remember thinking, that's kind of how you can reveal a hero. Like, your hero can just emerge from this chaos. Chaos can be a really great tool. basically kind of like magic, like it throws people for a little bit, and then suddenly there's this person that emerges that kind of alleviates the chaos, and suddenly they become important and they matter, and you want them to stay there because otherwise you don't know what to do, and then when they leave, you feel sad. So I think in doing a lot of these tests, I was able to sort of see how those things could be useful to me as a creator, I guess.
So far, the rig stays still, or have you moved it? What do you think that it has to stay still for any reason, or is it only because the technology wants to? Where do you think that's going to go?
No, it has nothing to do with the technology. I mean, I could put that camera on a drone and be like, wee, and just like take it everywhere, which people do, and it's sad. Yeah, you know what's up. It's really just the consideration that the camera is a person. Like the person doesn't exist as soon as they put the headset on. It exists as soon as they press record. Suddenly that's a person. I should consider it a person. I should treat it with respect, or not, depending what the film is, I guess. Hopefully respect. But anything that happens to that camera will happen to a person. How someone treats the rig, how they'll look at it. The guy that was staring at you from the stands of that game was not like glaring at me or another human being. He probably wouldn't even give me 2 looks if he thought it was just a person standing there. He looked at it because it was a frickin' 360 camera that he's probably never seen before, just hanging out next to him. And that, it makes a difference, and you feel that, and you just kind of, it feels good in that situation. It's the difference between going into, there's, in good ways and in bad, I think, like a refugee genre in VR, which is like, well, let's go to this refugee camp. We're in the middle of this crisis, and we're going to put a rig down, and we're going to film it. You're going to feel like you're there, and you're going to feel like you're part of the community, and you're going to feel empathy. It's like, what? Okay, thank you for showing me that. I would never have seen that otherwise, so thank you. I don't feel empathy necessarily. I feel bad, but I still feel like the other, because everyone's looking at me in that camp like, I shouldn't touch that camera. I can't touch that camera. I shouldn't look at that camera. And it's usually like, manned or womaned by someone that's not part of the community, because those people in that community don't have access to that kind of stuff. So you start to really think about, what relationship does this camera have with that community? Is it something that community is using, is comfortable with? And that translates to the person in the space. We'll make powerful experiences when we actually, care about that. And more than we've ever cared about having someone from that place film something before. I think it's a fundamental difference between the other and those that actually have, the stories there. Those who can tell their own stories. But in terms of motion, I think it's just, if I just picked you up right now, or someone out of nowhere, as you're talking to me, picked you up right now, and then like tossed you over there, you probably wouldn't like that very much.
Not so much.
So I think it's something we need to consider, is that you can't do that to a person. Or maybe you can, but that has ramifications, has consequences. And so it's really about compelling someone to feel very much like they want to move over there. So like, say you're looking at me and you're talking, and then suddenly this big monstrous thing comes barreling towards you. You probably want to move backwards at the very least, or get out of here. So that fight or flight response, that need to move, that need to go somewhere else, if someone were to at that point pick you up and move you, you'd feel fine. There's a thing called the cockpit effect, where you're in a car, hopefully not accelerating or decelerating, because that makes you sick. But as long as that's consistent, you can move through a space. And we talk about cockpit like a car or a plane, but if you do it with people, I call it flocking. I've come up with lots of really weird terms, but the idea is that you have like people around you, and collectively that group moves forward. And because we for safety reasons, we always want to move with the crowd. We want to feel safe and not the other in that sense. You are compelled to move forward. So as long as that's happening, you can move that camera forward. So it's really about understanding how compelled someone wants to move. If that person has no reason to move, then you should not move them, in my opinion. unless there's some narrative reason to make someone feel really uncomfortable. And also, this is the more boring part of it, if it's like an elevator or a boat or something that is meant to move human beings, it's generally okay too.
It's going to work. A lot of the examples we've been talking about are putting the camera into a space that like this that exists, that's not contrived in the sense that it's a naturally occurring space. Have you worked in spaces where you have, in the sense that you might add all the elements to that, manage them, control them, choreograph them yourself? Have you been working in that space as well?
Yeah, Resonance was that. That was my first kind of attempt to do that. It's hard. It's really hard. I don't think, I mean, I'm proud of that film. I don't think it was successful because of, I think if given more time and probably more resources, I would want to really fully like find the right places, construct the right things. I think everyone as a filmmaker was like, if I only had more time, if I only had more money, if I only had. But I do. I feel like I really want to get in. I'm going to refine it. It's going to evolve. I think, you know, unpacking narrative and what that is. You know, how can I use the inevitability of what story could be and the range of that to then inform how I go about writing this stuff. I actually, I have a theory, which I'm excited about. I don't know if it, I mean, we'll see if it works, but the idea is basically working backwards, coming up with the, you know, this is what I want the story to be when someone leaves. How do I get there? And then thinking about identity, thinking about the rules of the universe, thinking about how I would craft that universe, how that motion would go, the overall arcing feeling as they go through this journey through this, and then go back to that story and refine it, and then go back, and then go back. Also understanding that the story will never be like a formal thing, but then you start to break apart what that story actually means. And then you start to get something that was very literal into something that was, that's a bit more nebulous, but is still the spirit, the true spirit of the thing. So truth, love, honor, family. Like you start to almost single word it a little bit. So as long as that's the feeling, like family, good. If that, it's like it's primitive kind of. It's like food, delicious. It's like, okay. Like that, if that's the story, if it's in that range, then it's successful. So yeah, that's sort of the process that I'm working through right now. It seems like it could work.
It's we spoke briefly before about the fact that I think that it's, you put the camera into a space, it captures the world as it exists, and then all the issues we're discussing around where does the attention lie. I come from a theatre background, and in theatre, it's the common problem is where do you direct people's attention, and the camera itself is inherently going to capture naturalism, whereas theatre is an inherently not naturalistic medium. It's lights rise and fall. It's in a black box. Only the things you want people to see have been placed in that space. So I'm interested in that tension between the DNA of naturalism that's in what a camera can capture, but also this idea that you may be able to use techniques from other forms like theatre to direct attention.
Yeah, I've been talking a lot with, so Oscar Raby and Katie Morrison, who run Vertov, which is not too far from here, a really great VR company. They have 2 pieces that are here that are great. We actually were talking with the National Theatre in London because Oscar was really into trying to figure out kind of what he could bring from theatre to his work. And I got to see the National Theatre and things that they've been doing and see a play that they were running, which was amazing. But there are lots of things, like, you know, the fact that, you know, in a second you could have the entire set change and not notice it. You have elements of the set that move and, like, you know, stuff built into the bottom that reveals, like, people can climb out of and climb back into, and you don't know where they came from or what they're doing. But it happens, and it's amazing. The realism of, like, what's the lowest common denominator of a prop before it becomes irrecognizable as that thing, but it's still not the actual thing. Like, where does the realism there lie? But yeah, there's lots of things learned from theater, tons. Lighting, especially. Acting, yeah, it's a different kind of acting, but yeah. Game design to me is the biggest. you know, I think there are a lot of different parts of different mediums that are important, but game design to me personally feels like they've always thought about world building. They've always thought about the person that's in their space. They're always thinking about the journey, hopefully. They're thinking about like, okay, someone's gonna go into this universe, not know a darn thing about what to do. I need 2 levels, maybe more, maybe, you know, less, to have them understand how to deal with that universe. You don't go into Super Mario Brothers and you're like, King Koopa, go. You know, it's like, you have like, oh, if I hit this, you know, question mark box, there's a mushroom, and if I eat the mushroom, I get big. And those turtle dove things are really evil, and I shouldn't touch them. I should, oh, if I jump on them and I can, you know, move them. Then in consequential games, you could pick them up and you can throw the shells around. So it's like you kind of, they understand that there's a sequence to these things. It might just be a human thing too. It's like, it might just be something that over time we don't need. I don't think, based upon games and how they've evolved over time, but you know, because like something like Myst, they just drop you on an island and say, figure it out. You know, and you're like, okay, sure. There's a weird guy over there, and there's some pages and books that mean something. And I really love that game, though. I like that. But I think that there's a lot to learn from that camp that I think will be very, very useful in terms of case studies to see what could work in VR.
I'm kind of interested, fascinated about the fact that in the game environment, as you say, you're making wide-awake choices in a sense. You're consciously looking at, do I go to this prop, do I pick it up, what do I do with it? Whereas my background in film, you're hoping people will be almost in a dream state and much less conscious state. And a lot of what we've been talking about in terms of VR seems to be that it's an all-encompassing primary experience of complete immersion and engagement. Do you think that that's incompatible with this notion, the gaming notion of making choices? Do you think awareness, is it up to the filmmaker to control and manipulate the choices that someone's making?
I think it's just with the visitor in mind. I think, yeah. I mean, it's a responsibility we have. There's this. I can't remember the guy, but he did this TED talk about the anxiety of choice. The more choices we're actually given, the worse we feel. He uses an example of a jean shop. He says he bought you used to go to one store, you get one pair of jeans, and it didn't fit very well at all, but it was there. You buy them, you take them home, you'd wear them for 10 years, and then you'd go and do it again. But then he said he went into a jean shop recently where it was like, do you want bootcut? Do you want acid wash? Do you want like, you know, these 5 different colors? Do you want like taper? Do you want baggy? Do you want... And he said after, you know, 2 hours in that shop, he came out and he had the perfect pair of jeans, best pair of jeans, and he felt miserable. Like he had wasted his life. And you kind of, and his whole thing was like, you know, you give people too many choices, it just drives us nuts. Sometimes we just want to be told, like, you only have one choice. And so I think it's important for us to understand, it's not to say that we should always give someone one choice and just alleviate every other possibility. I think or eliminate every possibility. It's more about understanding what the results are by giving too much choice. Yeah. And again, that could be a narrative element. We can decide that maybe there is something where too many choices, and the feeling you get from too many choices is in itself something that can emotionally add or be another narrative layer to a world. Yeah. You can feel the anxiety of a student trying to figure out which college to go to, having to hear her parents, hear her friends, hear her, you know, mentors, having peer pressure, maybe not wanting to go. You know, feeling that pressure doesn't necessarily have to be someone that is by herself doing it. It could be a shared experience where suddenly you feel the anxiety of something, and you know it's because she's feeling anxiety too. And suddenly you can relate in a way that you wouldn't have related to before. Editing in film I used to be an editor just primarily, and like that's what you did. Like you would put together show reels for a place, like a production house. And the idea is to make it feel like, yeah, we're great and we're happy and energy and yeah. And so you'd cut kind of benign pieces of content, put a track onto it and just have this flow and this movement and this energy to kind of give the sense that that's the kind of place that it was. So yeah, I think feeling an emotion as a result of elements in a world or choices that you can make can really help engage someone and have them relate more to the story that you're trying to get them to tell later.
You mentioned when we spoke on the phone a while ago that you enjoy VR experiences because when they're successful for you, they're almost like meditation. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that VR is in that sense, potentially a very different experience to what you're talking about, quick cutting, overstimulating, the traditional media that we're aware of?
Yeah, when I say meditation, it's more just like the feeling that you get after meditation, right? Because meditation is you are concentrating on your breath, you're concentrating on the flow of your breath, you are trying to block out everything else and have one focal point to do something. What VR is particularly good at in its current technological stage is blocking out everything else with this headset. And then you put on headphones and suddenly you're transported to a different world where a lot of the things that you thought mattered to you no longer apply. Email, work, your dog, whatever. You're just like suddenly, unless he's walking around, which mine does. And he hates it when I have a headset on. So you're suddenly compelled to only have one job-ish. And you're figuring it out. And suddenly you're this different person and you have different responsibilities. And something that I think that we talked about was, I don't necessarily believe it to be, it's not the same as like a lean back film experience, even in the time of day or in the use cases that we're trying to push them through. So, at the end of the day, the last thing I want to do is be in VR. I don't. I just want to go home and sit down and either eat something or watch TV or play a game, and that's it. I don't want to go into a headset and, paint. I'm not there. Some people might be, that's fine. But what I end up doing is during the middle of the day or earlier in the day, I will. I sometimes do it when I feel tired and I know that I need to go to another meeting. I'll spend 15, 20 minutes, watch an experience, come out of it and feel great. Doesn't even matter what the experience is, just the idea that I could focus or just kind of leave for a little bit and come back was awesome. I suddenly can hear things better, my attention to detail is stronger. And I don't feel the fatigue of being in a theater for 2 hours. I don't feel the fatigue of playing The Witness for 3 hours, 4 hours. Or any sort of video game where, I'm leaning back and just pressing some buttons. It just feels different. And I think that I don't think I'm the only one who feels that way, and I think the more that we see it being adapted by people and how they actually use it and seeing how they integrate with it, you'll find that I think we'll be able to figure out more, I don't know what those things are, but kind of figure out how to cater to that kind of use case a bit better.
Yeah. I was talking to an academic who works more in AR than this space, but he talked about the contemporary experience as being the denarrativization of experience, in the sense that we're so overwhelmed with pre-planned little narratives. We're besieged with them everywhere we look, whether it's a commercial or a half-hour drama or a full-length drama or whatever. We're constantly being overwhelmed with narrative. And I put Aliens on for my 15-year-old, and one of my favourite films. 40 minutes in, he said, "When is it going to get interesting?" Horror. But for him, the experience he's having is that he's curating his own experience with multiple screens constantly and creating his own narratives out of his experiences. And I think it sounds to me, in a way, what you're saying is VR is an opportunity to provide primary source material for people and give them back the responsibility of creating their own narratives. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it definitely, yes, absolutely. We are more prone to taking out our phones and taking photos of our food than looking at the food and eating the food and maybe talking to people. We want to say yeah, I got that. We want to collect that stuff. It's kind of why Pokemon Go is so popular, I think. It's just because we like the idea of collecting things. We just want to keep collecting. And it feeds our brain because we're like, I did that and I got it. I did that and I got that, you know. And it's like, it's funny now that the same devices that we've been using to almost block out the true nature of experiences are now becoming portals to those true experiences. And I love that idea, that we can then use them to say like, hey, by the way, this is actually pretty great. Like, just spend some time, you know. And I actually find that I take far less photos now than I did. Where I actually, when I see something that's actually pretty profound, I actually let it happen. Mostly because, you know, for my work, I'd be doing everyone a grave disservice if I didn't let experiences actually be experiences. And I found a lot of things out just by virtue of watching what people do. Not, you know, not right now, we're just talking, but not every time I say that, people are like, okay, that's cool. No, I think it's just, you know, the nuances of stuff, the way that people handle, like, you know, I always end up looking at the person that's not doing what everyone else is doing, wondering why. You know, not looking at the sunset, looking at where everyone else is looking, how they're engaging with it. And it's remarkable when you do that. Like, beyond just seeing the thing that's the point. Like, take away the phone for a second, watch the sunset, but then next time you see something that's remarkable, turn and see how it's affecting everybody. It's amazing. You have, the world is vast and, you know, crazy, and it's just, you see kind of this beauty and this nuance that you'd never see. Even looking up, you know, I find it just, it's crazy. The subtle things that we can do as physical beings in reality can really, beyond informing where VR goes, can also kind of make our lives and enrich our lives in a way that is really powerful.
I was interested, one of the pieces you created was Deep Dream VR.
Yeah.
And again, that's not in naturalism. You've gone way beyond that and providing a different sort of primary experience. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was really interested. So I'm a firm believer in that, you know, we all see the color red differently, right? I mean, baseline. We see an orange, and there are different contexts. You might think of something different. I can think of something different. Someone with bad eyesight, someone with bad hearing will experience a thing different than me. Someone who's 60, different. You get it. It's like, it's different. Everyone has subtly different experiences. But beyond that, the human experience is extremely limited. If you think about quantum computing, or quantum physics or mechanics, if you think of the way the universe actually functions compared to what we as humans are able to perceive, there's a lot going on that we just can't get. What's interesting about AI is that, and the art coming from artificial intelligence and machine learning systems, is that it pushes perception. It takes what we believe as humans to be perception, and it kind of engages that and says, well, yeah, but like with those parameters, I can see this. Can you see that? Where it's like, nope, I don't see a bunch of eyes mapped to that tree. That's weird. So Deep Dream is one of those examples where it basically took this idea of enhance. I'm not an engineer, so bear with me. But you know, in those movies, they'd say enhance, and something that looked really low res suddenly could magnify 100 times, and you see a little guy hiding behind a tree. You're just like, oh, totally, that happens. So they tried that because they're like, well, let's see if that works. And so they trained a system on, you know, a large data set of photos. And what ended up happening was that it then took the pixels of it and began to almost reimagine the image, to the point that you got like these kind of bizarre looking like puppy slug things and like rope snakes and like all these kind of weird trippy looking imagery, because it did do what it was told to do, but then it just sort of interpreted things differently under those parameters. And that's called Deep Dream. And there's some really great work done from this guy Mike Tyka and Doug Fritz and these guys at the machine learning team in Seattle. Coincidentally, the jump team that I generally work with, the engineers, are also in Seattle. So I ended up sitting very close to those guys. And we talked a lot about, could we do that kind of image interpretation in VR? in stereo, so you could see depth. And we worked on it, and we got it to work. And it's pretty crazy. I think I could show it, I think. Okay. You might have to see some, I might have to open another thing. Bear with me. See if I have. It's funny, you make a crap ton of these things, and it can just be like, oh, you know what? Let's just see some stuff. Don't worry about that. So this is a scene from Iceland. If you look at the river, so it's mapping a bunch of interesting eyes on it. I don't think yeah, it's pretty great, right? I wonder if I have the actual, let's see if I have more to that. No, I don't think I do, sadly. Oh no, yeah, I do a little bit. So, I mean, the unfortunate part about showing you this while you're out there is that when you're actually in a space and you're watching water suddenly become these floating eyeballs down a stream, it's pretty compelling as a thing. That's about it. That one didn't work out so well. But the idea behind it was just to sort of see, with certain parameters, but unfiltered, what would happen if I just let this system go and interpret it. What's interesting is you can actually use that to harness that would be interesting, right? Using it as a way of like having a dream sequence, maybe using it to show that someone might be going slightly mad, beyond like if you imagine Hamlet, imagine being in his head during like the most traumatic time for him, and then suddenly the world just becomes this kind of weird, bizarre, strange, violent place. It's just, or it could be something that's very euphoric and very dreamlike, like you're having a dream and people's, it could be something that's not necessarily like this, but it could be like, the face is a composite of all the different, ages that person had. And you take an actor's face and using machine learning, again, I don't know if this is necessarily possible right now. You can then de-age and then age it and then make a composite of it, and suddenly that's a character. When I think about my mom in any context, I think about, if I thought about her when I was 5, it's my mom now plus a younger mom, I guess, plus and it's kind of awkward and it's not really a literal interpretation. Yeah. So I think it's hard for us sometimes to see that or to think about that, but that's something that, systems could be like, hey, like that could be a thing. It's sort of, you can use the kind of cooperation between a system and a creator to make these experiences that are more like dreams, more like memories. Yeah.
So we're getting towards the end of our time, but in that, that's clearly one way that the future of VR could lie in terms of giving primary experience to people that is not available in our normal perception of reality. Where else do you think it'll go if you wanted to be a futurist for a minute?
I feel like I'm like that all the time. I'm like, in the future, there will be pizza VR. That would be good. I think it's, I think the future lies in, I do think this is primarily where it's gonna go. A lot of the idea of agency and choices, understanding where, actually there was I can't remember his name and I feel bad about this, but there was a game designer who said, he was like, why has there not been a Citizen Kane for game design? And his argument was, there was no value to life, really. Like there was no, you die and you get respawned. That's sort of the deal. But the other thing was that once you died and came back, no one remembered that you were ever there at all. Nothing you had done mattered and never really compounded or made a difference in everything. And if you think about optimization problems, if you think about things that computers can do extremely well, or systems can do extremely well that we just can't, because we're limited by our reptilian brains, is this idea of being able to push the possibilities and the potentials of various strings of narratives or various outcomes of choices, to give us sort of this agency that, and change the world and morph the world and change characters and do all of that pretty remarkably in a way that we can't necessarily do as creators by ourselves. But on top of that, it's also about, and the whole thing about VR is about unpacking everything that we believe, rewiring what we believe, unfiltering ourselves, unfiltering experiences. And we may not be able to, by ourselves, do that. We need help. And so even from the idea of deep dream, just being able to say, our brains have evolved like this. But what happens if we take that out? What happens? What if we stripped away all the filters that prevent us from really coming to terms with true experience and really experiencing things the way that they are meant to, or maybe beyond that? How, where does that lie? And I think that's where a lot of the melding of artificial intelligence and this work will go. And it will become an art form in this homogenous way.
Well, it's been a real privilege to sit here and talk to you for a while. Thank you so much. I've genuinely enjoyed our chat. Just a couple of things. If you're interested, there's a social meetup at 3 o'clock at the Acme Cafe, if you'd like to hang out there. And if you wouldn't mind just helping us clear the room, there's another session starting in here in half an hour. But please join me again in thanking Jessica Brillhart. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.